there are new models out, and the new models are suggesting elevated levels of death. That, of course, is not a surprise. And anybody who's telling you that it's a surprise is being a fool. Of course, there are going to be elevated risks of death when you start to reopen the economy. Everyone recognizes this. Every single human recognizes this. But if you recognize this, then people yell at you, because we're supposed to believe that there is a policy out there, a unicorn policy that allows us to not completely tank the entire world economy until the end of time, and also saves every single life. That's not a possibility. And if you mention that there are trade-offs to policy, as I've been saying for a while, and this is my bugaboo right now, is that nobody will honestly discuss the trade-offs to policy. So instead, we have stupid conversations about, if you don't like my policy, it's because you want people to die. Like that, I'm sorry, that is complete idiocy. And nobody actually believes that. Nobody actually believes that. Let me give you an example of this kind of logic that is being used right now, and then we'll get to some of the new studies. So Andrew Cuomo yesterday, he was talking about how you make the calculation in New York to reopen. And he said that a human life is priceless. Well, on a moral level, of course a human life is priceless. Of course a human life is priceless. But on a political policy-making level, we make risk calculations about the risks we are willing to undertake in public life literally all the time. All the time. Every element of policy is like this. If Andrew Cuomo really believed in public policy terms, not in moral terms, in public policy terms, that you have to mitigate the risk to every human life down to zero, he could never discuss reopening, because there is no bar that would be low enough to clear for that. Right? So here is Andrew Cuomo yesterday suggesting a human life is priceless, period. But if that were the case, he could never reopen, including in upstate New York, including in rural areas, because anytime you tell people they can leave their homes, you have increased their risk. So here's Andrew Cuomo yesterday. This is, again, the if it just saves one life logic is not political logic. It is simply posturing and demagoguery. Here is Andrew Cuomo yesterday.
There's a cost of staying closed. There's also a cost of reopening quickly. That is the hard truth that we are all dealing with. And let's be honest about it. And let's be open about it. And let's not camouflage the actual terms of the discussion that we're having. And the question comes back to, how much is a human life worth? To me, I say, cost of a human life is priceless, period.
Okay, but he doesn't actually believe that, right? Nobody believes in public policy terms that a human life is priceless, truly. Now, a human life is priceless in moral terms, in meaning that we have to prohibit murder, right? We have to prohibit, people have said, when I point this out, that in public policy, we actually calculate the value of human lives on actuarial tables, right? We actually do this. It's called quality adjusted life years. It is a chief factor in every calculation we ever do about public policy. Because if we actually believed that every human life was quote unquote priceless in public policy terms, we would put you in a plastic bubble and leave you there and feed you through a feeding tube, presumably. But when it comes to protecting human life from others' predations, right, that would be like abortion, for example, then of course there's no countervailing cost in terms of stopping people from killing other people, right? You may think that there's a priority to a woman being able to kill an unborn child. I do not think that that is a priority. I think the priority is saving the person's life. Okay, that's it. There's a trade-off, but the trade-off there does not look like the trade-off with regard to destroying the entire American economy, for example, which would involve the deaths of presumably hundreds of thousands or millions of people and cost to hundreds of millions of people as well. Right? When you outlaw murder, there presumably is a countervailing cost to outlawing murder, namely the murderers go to jail. Right? But that is not a cost that stacks up against the loss of human life when it comes to public policy making. Every human life is priceless in the sense that you cannot deliberately take the life of another human being. But in terms of what levels of risk are we willing to tolerate as a society in order to live free, there the answer is, well, it's not quite priceless, because you are then asked to value your own life. And we as a society are asked to make the decision as to what levels of risk we're willing to tolerate for everybody in the public sphere. This is the question of public policy. And so it is a cop-out for Andrew Cuomo to say every life is priceless when it comes to policymaking. Because again, he doesn't even believe that. If he believed that, then he wouldn't be opening up at all. There'd be no situation under which you could open up. And so this has become the go-to argument of people who don't even want to have a discussion about reopening or how to reopen in a responsible fashion. This is how you end up with this idiotic tweet with 34,000 retweets from Kumail Nanjiani, a guy from Silicon Valley. I guess he's in one of the new Marvel movies, if eventually we go back to the movies. He tweeted out, after weeks of careful preparation, planning, and strategizing, most of the country has landed on the following approach. Let's just open it all up and see what happens. Not a single governor has settled on that approach. Not one. Not one. There are 0 people who have settled on that approach. I mean, this is like, come on. Come on. Nobody's talking about this. But the way that people talk about this in order to avoid the discussion is by suggesting that the alternative to lockdowns are completely opening it up without thinking about how to protect the elderly, without thinking about how to protect nursing homes, without thinking about how to protect the vulnerable. Literally, no one is discussing that. No one. Okay, but at some point, one of the conversations that we are going to have is, again, what level of risk are we willing to tolerate? And in past episodes, I've talked about the need to make those risk calculations with regard to everything from the number of kids in public schools to the speed limits, right? If you wanted to prevent deaths and every life were quote unquote priceless in public policy terms, you would lower the speed limits to 2 miles an hour because elderly people and 16 and 17-year-olds are disproportionately killed in car accidents. We don't do that. We tolerate a certain level of risk in life. Toleration of risk in public policy does assume that we can value certain economic costs against the additional risk that people are going to hurt themselves. This is why you buy insurance. Insurance companies do this for a living every single day. This is what they do. Remember, everybody keeps talking about that flattening of the curve stuff, right? The flattening of the curve was designed, again, to prevent the overwhelm of the healthcare system. This is what the curve was originally supposed to look like, right? Here was the big curve. On your left-hand side of the page, you can see the big spike. The line is the medical capacity. And then here is the lower curve. The lower curve is supposed to stay below that line. Great. But in terms of total number of infections, the total number of infections is going to be exactly the same. So when we look at those models that look through June, that is not enough. You would actually have to look at the model through the extent of the year and then decide on economic costs here. These are all the calculations but it's important to note them because no one is willing to discuss this stuff out loud. It is politically unpalatable to discuss this stuff out loud, which means that the policy is going to end up being really stupid. Because if you can't discuss out loud the actual considerations that are going in, what you end up with is, on the one hand, the posturing of people who suggest that they're going to save every life. Andrew Cuomo is not going to save every life. The dumbass just started cleaning the subways 5 seconds ago. It's May, guys. It's May. They shut down everything in March except the subways, the chief incubator for this thing. They only started cleaning the subway systems at night now, like yesterday. But he's saying he's out there saving every life. Of course, that is not true. Of course, that is not true. But we've reduced our conversation to the dumbest possible point. We're going to start having to have these tough conversations about when to reopen, what the actual costs are, what are the monetary costs. It's so funny. People say data and science, and Trump is using his gut about reopening. I'll tell you who's using their gut about reopening. People who refuse to even have the conversation about mathematical values that are used in every other actuarial investigation of every other policy in human history. Frankly, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. You have to make these calculations because there is no other way to make the calculations. Otherwise, you are just reduced to, my gut is that we should just stay in. Until when? I don't know. Until what happens? What are the costs? Well, it doesn't matter. Every human life is priceless. That is not policymaking. That is posturing.